Hello and welcome back. I'm glad that you're back with us again, and today we're going to be studying Psalms 53. Now, Psalms 53 is pretty common. We hear it a lot, and the part that we usually hear is, "A fool in his heart says there is no God." Before we just jump off into what a fool is and how we as Christians are not supposed to use that word, let's talk about the history behind this psalm. This is one of the few psalms which are almost duplicated word for word with just a few differences in two different places. There's a couple of psalms like that, but this one is one of them. We have Psalms 53, and it's almost duplicate of Psalms 14. And yet, also this psalm is one that's often quoted in the New Testament. So we will see as we go along about that quote in the New Testament. Let's talk about the history behind the psalm. Let's go back way back to when the Israelites first entered the land of Canaan. It was a brand new generation. They had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and all the older generation had died off, and there was just two that saw not only the wilderness in Egypt, but came into the land of Canaan. Those two were Joshua and Caleb. And Caleb is one of those characters you don't hear much about, other than he and Joshua came back from spying out the land of Canaan and said that they could take it because God was God. And Caleb, whenever they crossed the Jordan, he got the choice of all the land. He got first choice of all the land, and so he chose a very fertile part of the land of Canaan. And so this also set him up to be a very prosperous, very wealthy. And this is all part of God's rewarding him for being faithful. And he passed this land generation after generation on down. And even as we look at the genealogy of Caleb, Othniel, the first judge of the tribes of Israel, was also a descendant of Caleb. And so we have a long history until we get to a man named Nabal. And Nabal was a direct descendant of Caleb. And it's interesting about Nabal is that he was very wealthy, but there was a problem because he forgot where he got his wealth was from God and not being self-made. When we're talking about Nabal, we also have to talk about the customs of the day. There was a king of Israel. Saul was the king, but there were also overrun, occupied by the enemy armies, the Philistines, and they would often raid these farms and take everything they had. And the only defense was usually if you had some guys out there that would protect you. Now, David had his army, about 600, and that's what he did. He went about that area, the whole area, protecting the farmers, the landowners, from being raided by the enemy. And as a result, Nabal had prospered very well. It was a custom, if you were being protected by these armies, that when harvest time came, that you would give some of the provisions to the armies. You would share the harvest with them. So it was harvest time. Nabal was planning a big feast, a big celebration, and David sent his men, a couple of his young men, to Nabal to ask him to share part of the harvest with them since they had protected him. Nabal insulted the young man. They insulted him with his fall from prominence. They insulted his heritage, his family. They insulted him being a rebel from the king. And all three of these, were not as a result of David's actions. Yes, David's family was in exile, but it's because that Saul was hunting him. There was a fall from prominence, but it wasn't from what David did. It was from Saul's jealousy. And so these things which he insulted David over were actually pretty sensitive spots because they weren't David's fault. When these young men returned to David, David became furious. He gathered his fighting men because not only had that tradition of sharing the harvest been rejected, he had been insulted. And he was gathering his fighting men, and he was going to go destroy Nabal, his house, his servants, and everything. He was that furious. It was when he was preparing his men that Abigail, that was Nabal's wife, came, and she had brought with her the provisions of the harvest that he had asked for. And this was all secret to Nabal. Nabal did not know that she had done this, but she knew that Nabal had insulted David and there would be repercussions. So she came to David and begged and soothed the anger. And David realized what a mistake he had almost made. And that in his anger, he had almost killed innocent people. Abigail returned, didn't tell Nabal what was going on. Nabal was in the middle of a feast that was fit for a king. And that night, the Bible says that his heart turned to stone. And he suffered for 10 days, and then he died. Just a couple of interesting notes about that. Why did God have him suffer for 10 days before he died? Well, if you remember back whenever the spies were going into the land of Canaan, how many spies were there that went to the land of Canaan and came back and said, we can't do this, the enemy is too big, because they didn't credit God? It was 10, the same number. So here we have Nabal, who didn't credit God for what he had received, and he died after 10 days. The verse that is quoted in the New Testament from Psalm 53 is not a fool in his heart says there is no God. It's that there is none that are righteous, no, not one. Now, when we look at this, we can't help but wonder if David, when he wrote the psalm, and it says, a fool in his heart, didn't think of Abigail's husband, because the word for a fool is Nabal. I find that kind of interesting. And I don't think David could have written this psalm without at least thinking about it. And when he's thinking about what almost happened, he's saying to themselves, but there's none that are righteous, because even I almost committed a major sin. A fool in his heart says there is no God. Let's examine that just for a second. Today, we have different kinds of atheists. The first kind of atheist that we have is someone who just is ignorant or just doesn't know or questions. Now, today we call these agnostics. They just don't know. They wonder, but they don't know. Okay? Then we have what we call atheist today, but it's someone who is conscientiously denying the existence of God, and sometimes they're even antagonistic to anyone who does believe in God. They can become God's enemy. That's the second kind of atheist. The third kind of atheist is probably the most dangerous, especially to the church and us Christians. The third kind of atheist is the person who says they believe in God, but then doesn't act like it, and they don't live like it. If we really believed in God, we would live like it, and we would act like it, and we couldn't deny it. Now, we're given examples of this types of atheism in the New Testament. And I want to go back to the story of the two lost sons. That's in Luke chapter 15. And in Luke chapter 15, there's a man who has two sons. And one of them, the younger one, says to his dad, I would like all my inheritance now. Basically, what he's telling him is, you're dead to me. I want my money. And so the father graciously agreed to it. Now, the father didn't have to. The father could have told him, go jump off a cliff. But the father agreed to it and sold what he had that would have been the son's and gave it to him. And the son went off into a far land, and he spent all the money. Now, this is a great amount of wealth, and he spent it. And then he became so destitute, he had to go feed pigs. Now, we are all familiar with this story, but there's a couple of things that I really want to point out. To someone who is Jewish, pigs were detestable. They were something that was disgusting. And here, the younger son had become a servant to the pigs. He had become a slave to the pigs. He had to feed them, and he himself was hungry. It wasn't until he was feeding the pigs and so hungry that he came to his senses. And that's what the Bible says, literally. He came to his senses. And when he came to his senses, it says, my servants in my Father's house are better off than this. As Christians, we all need that pig pen moment. We need that moment when we come to our senses and decide, I need to be in my Father's house. Little children, when they're growing up, they don't say, I want to grow up to be an addict. They don't say, I want to grow up to be alcoholic. They don't say, I want to be addicted to pornography. They don't say that I want to beat my spouse. But yet, as adults, we often become the servants of the things we detest as being a child. And just like that son that was sitting in the pig pen, we finally realize that the pigs have become our master. The story's not over there, because this man has two sons. The younger son, he returns home. The father runs to meet him, restores him, and wants to throw a party. And the older son, he wasn't happy. And the sad thing about it, and this is the point that Timothy Keller makes in his book, Prodigal God, because it was obvious that the father was hurting over the younger son's departure. The job of the older son would be to go and find him for his dad. But yet, when the younger son returned, he was upset. And he was like a child with his nose against the window, wanting to go in and saying, why wasn't this ever done for me? That should be where we recognize the party is inside the house, not outside. And if we want to enjoy the blessings of what was going on, we need to be in the house. But yet the father comes out to the son and says, come into the house. But that's where the story ends. So we don't ever know whether the older son ever went in or not. With us as Christians, we need to always be accepting of the prodigal son when they come home. In fact, if we want to be good sons, we go out looking for them to bring them in. If you'll bear with me, I want to read this passage that I think that will say a lot about David in his moment. Okay. But as for me, my feet came close to stumbling. My steps had almost slipped, for I was envious of the arrogant as I saw the prosperity of the wicked. When I pondered to understand this, it was troublesome in my sight, until I came to the sanctuary of God and then perceived their end. We don't know if this was written by David. It could have been written by Asaph. But either way, this in Psalm 73 really describes David at this moment. When we see this psalm, we can understand why that Paul uses it in the New Testament to say there are none that are righteous, no, not one. In both of these cases with the lost sons, neither of them were right. The younger son became right. He made his life right. But we don't know about the older son. But that goes to show us there are none that are righteous, no, not one. One thing that we need to remember, and it's a hard concept to grasp, God's grace is His sovereign property. He extends it to who He wants to. Whether we feel that person is worthy or not, God extends grace to whoever He wants. Now in chapter 6, we'll be switching gears again, and we are going to talk about unanswered prayer. I hope you've enjoyed the video so far, but I want to encourage you to also get the book, Lyrics by Adonai. Not only does it allow a more in-depth study of the Psalms, but it's filled with questions and meditations, and it's a great study guide for either personal study or a group Bible study. And remember, just as stone sharpens stone, share it with a friend, and then talk about it after.